The modern seeker typically arrives at the gates of the great mystery, not in a state of triumph, but in a state of defeat. They are driven not by the promise of power, but by the haunting resonance of an internal collapse. It is a specific gravity, a crushing weight that descends upon the consciousness, turning the vibrancy of the external world into a landscape of grey ash. This is the Nigredo. In the ancient lexicon of alchemy, it is the blackening, the initial phase of the magnum opus. But to the contemporary mind, untrained in the language of symbols, it often appears simply as ruin. It is essential, therefore, to first frame this experience not as a pathology to be medicated, but as a philosophical problem to be solved. The genesis of this quest lies in the discomfort of the soul within its conditioned environment. Historically, this concept is as old as the human capacity for self-reflection. We trace its intellectual lineage back to the shadowy origins of Western esotericism. In the foundational texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, specifically the Emerald Tablet, we are told that the subtle must be separated from the gross with great industry. This implies that the starting state of man is a mixture, a chaotic blend of the divine and the dirt. The Nigredo is the realization of this contamination. Paracelsus, the great iconoclast of 16th century medicine and alchemy, was explicit in his diagnosis of this condition. He posited that decay is the beginning of all birth. For Paracelsus, the Nigredo was the putrefactio, the rotting of the seed. Without the rot, the shell of the seed cannot break and the sprout cannot emerge. This biological metaphor was elevated by later thinkers into a psychological necessity. However, it was the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung who provided the bridge between the medieval retort and the modern couch. Jung realized that the alchemists, in their solitary struggles with matter, were not merely observing chemical reactions. They were projecting the drama of their own unconscious onto the elements. When the alchemist spoke of the black crow or the Ethiopian appearing in the flask, they were documenting the onset of a profound psychological depression that signals the withdrawal of energy from the outer world. The premise of our inquiry today is rigorous. The Nigredo is not an accident. It is a corrective mechanism of the psyche. In a modern era that fetishizes the solar consciousness, constant productivity, relentless positivity, and the uninterrupted expansion of the ego, the Nigredo acts as the compensatory saturnine force. It is the inevitable counterweight. The initial spark of the true Hermetic path is, paradoxically, the extinguishing of the false lights of the ego. It is the moment the individual realizes that the map they have been given by society no longer matches the territory of their interior experience. The true secret, which the ancients guarded with codes and ciphers, is that this darkness is not the end of the road, but the very pavement of the path itself. The gold of the philosophers is not a metal, but a state of integrated consciousness that can only be forged in the absence of light. To navigate the abyss of the Nigredo without succumbing to madness requires a map. We cannot rely on vague spiritual platitudes. We require a robust philosophical architecture. The Hermetic tradition provides this through the doctrine of the compound and the operations of the Tria Prima, the three primal principles. Understanding the Nigredo necessitates an understanding of what is being dismantled. According to Paracelsian alchemy, all created things are a trinity of sulfur, soul, flammability, consciousness, Mercury, spirit, volatility, bridge, and salt, body, solidity, resistance. In the uninitiated or natural man, these three principles exist in a massa confusa, a confused lump. The salt of the ego is too heavy, acting as a leaden weight that suppresses the volatile spirit. The sulfur is impure, burning with the erratic fires of passion and desire rather than the steady light of the will. The Nigredo is the operational phase of solutio, solution, and separatio, separation. It is the chemical breaking of the bond between these principles. When the salt, the fixed habits, the rigid identity, the crystallized defense mechanisms, is dissolved, the structure of the personality collapses. This is the architect of the suffering. The system is designed to fail when it is no longer conducive to the growth of the essence. This systemic breakdown is not unique to alchemy. It is a perennial philosophy, echoed across the great esoteric traditions, suggesting a universal law of spiritual hydrodynamics. In the Lurianic Kabbalah, we encounter the concept of Shevirat HaKelim, the shattering of the vessels. The narrative suggests that the initial vessels of creation were unable to contain the intensity of the divine light. or Ein Sof. They shattered, and the shards of holiness fell into the realm of impurity, Klipoth. The human soul, in its dark night, mimics this cosmic catastrophe. The ego vessel shatters because the pressure of the individuating self has become too great. The Nigredo is the descent into the Klipoth to retrieve the sparks of light trapped in the husks of our own trauma and ignorance. Furthermore, we can draw a parallel to Christian mysticism and the via negativa. The apophatic theology teaches that God is found not by adding attributes but by subtracting them. The Nigredo is the experiential application of this theology. It is the stripping away of everything that is not God, or in psychological terms, not self. The mindset of the adept during this dissolution is the single most critical factor determining success or failure. The uninitiated panic when the dissolution begins. They scramble to rebuild the old structures, seeking comfort in old vices or distractions. The adept, however, practices the hermetic silence, tacere. This is not merely keeping one's mouth shut, it is an internal stillness. It is the refusal to allow the energy of the suffering to leak out through complaint or projection. This requires the cultivation of the magical will, thelema in the truest sense. This will is not the willpower to force reality to one's liking, but the will to align oneself with the inevitable process of disintegration. The adept adopts the attitude of the alchemical witness. They observe the rotting of their own persona with a cold, detached clinical eye. They understand that the I that is suffering is the very thing that must die. The ethical stance here is one of active skepticism toward one's own emotions. During the Nigredo, the emotional spectrum is dominated by despair, guilt, and anxiety. The adept knows these are the fumes of the chemical reaction, not the truth of the reality. Just as a chemist does not inhale the toxic vapors of the crucible, the Hermetic student learns not to identify with the toxic emotions of the Nigredo. They stand back. They watch the fire burn. They respect the operations of Saturn, the god of limits, time, and death, knowing that Saturn is also the gatekeeper of the highest wisdom. The doctrine is clear: no generation without corruption. To build the temple of the new man, the hovel of the old man must be razed to the ground. The Nigredo is often described as a chaotic sea, but within that chaos lies a precise, step-by-step itinerary. The Hermetic School analyzes this journey not as a vague period of sadness, but as a sequence of distinct alchemical operations, each with its own symbolism, psychological correlation, and archetypal challenge. We must dissect these stages with surgical precision. The process begins with the loss of the projective mechanism. In a normal state of unconscious existence, the human psyche projects its contents onto the world. We see the world not as it is, but as we are. We perceive our own aggression as the hostility of others. We perceive our own longing as the attractiveness of a lover. The entry into the Nigredo is marked by the retraction of these projections. This is the massa confusa, the confused mass. The energy that was flowing outward returns to the subject. Psychologically, this manifests as a sudden loss of interest in the things that once provided meaning. The career, the relationships, the hobbies, all lose their color. This is the lead taking over. Jung describes this as the damming up of libido. When the energy cannot flow out, it creates a swamp within. The individual feels heavy, stuck, and disoriented. The archetype active here is the drowning king. The king represents the dominant ego consciousness, the ruling principle of the life thus far. He falls into the sea, the unconscious. The adept feels like they are drowning in their own moods. This is not a failure, it is the prerequisite. The king must drown to be baptized. The confused mass is the raw material, the Prima materia, which contains all possibilities, but currently exists in a state of chaos. Once the king has drowned, the process of putrefaction, begins. The alchemical imagery for this stage is gruesome. Corpses in coffins, skeletons, black ravens feasting on carrion. This is the death of the persona. The persona is the mask we wear to interface with society, the good employee, the dutiful parent, the pious believer. It is a necessary social compromise, but it is artificial. In the Nigredo, the persona begins to rot. The adept finds they can no longer sustain the act. The discrepancy between who they are in the dark and who they pretend to be in the light becomes nauseating. Psychologically, this is experienced as a crisis of fraudulence. The adept feels dirty or unworthy. This stench, described in alchemical texts, is the realization of one's own hypocrisy. It is a humiliating phase, but humility is derived from humus, earth. The putrefactio turns the rigid pride of the ego into fertile soil, compost. Without this rotting of social pretension, no spiritual seed can take root. The adept must learn to sit with the smell of their own humanity, stripping away the delusions of grandeur. From the rotting mass, the operation of separatio, separation, distinguishes the subtle elements. This leads to the most perilous phase, the confrontation with the shadow. In the earlier stages, the shadow, the repressed, rejected aspects of the self, was projected onto enemies. Now the adept is forced to see the shadow within. This is the black sun, Sol Niger. The adept discovers that the very traits they despise in others, greed, cruelty, laziness, perversion, are alive and active within their own psyche. This realization shatters the moral superiority of the ego. It is the crucifixion of the self-image. Jung warned that this stage is dangerous. If the ego is too weak, it may be swallowed by the shadow, leading to acting out evil. If the ego is too rigid, it may shatter into psychosis. The hermetic task is integration. The adept must acknowledge, I am also this. The symbolism here is often the battle with the dragon or the wolf. The wolf represents the voracious, instinctual appetites that have been starved by civilized behavior. The Nigredo releases the wolf. The work is not to kill the wolf, but to tame it. The energy trapped in the shadow, the aggression, the lust, the selfishness, is raw vitality. By facing it without flinching, the adept reclaims this energy for the great work. The lead of depression is actually the weight of this unintegrated shadow, waiting to be transmuted. While putrefactio is a wet decomposition, calcinatio, calcination, is a dry purification. This stage involves the application of intense heat to burn away the dross. Psychologically, calcinatio is the frustration of desire. It is the fire of not getting what you want. When the ego is denied its cravings, be they for validation, pleasure, or control, it burns with rage and resentment. The uninitiated discharge this heat by screaming, blaming, or seeking distraction. The adept applies the hermetic seal. They hermetically seal the vessel of their consciousness, refusing to act out the frustration. This forces the heat back onto the substance of the psyche. This internal fire burns away the emotional attachments and complexes. It reduces the moisture of sentimentalism and the volatile reactivity of the emotions. What remains is the white ash, the pure, indestructible essence of the individual. This is the distinction between burning out, exhaustion, and burning up, purification. Calcinatio teaches the adept to endure the tension of the opposites. It burns away the identification with the emotion. One moves from I am angry to I'm experiencing the energy of anger. The ash that remains is the salt of wisdom, no longer reactive but stable. The zenith of the Nigredo is mortificatio. This is the experience of total abject defeat. It is the dark night in its most potent form. Here the ego finally gives up. The king is dead. The wolf has been faced. The fire has burned everything away. The adept enters a state of profound stillness and silence. The imagery is of the skull, caput mortuum. It represents the death of the old world. The adept feels abandoned by God, by the soul, and by life. Meaning has evaporated. However, in the Hermetic view, this death is the critical turning point. It is the grain of wheat falling into the earth. If it does not die, it remains alone. If it dies, it bears much fruit. The mortificatio destroys the illusion that the ego is the center of the universe. It creates a vacuum. This vacuum is necessary because only an empty vessel can be filled. The ego's ambitions must die so that the will of the self, the higher nature, can be born. The adept rests in this tomb, not in despair, but in a state of active waiting. They have become the hollow bone, ready for the breath of the spirit. It is imperative that we pause to analyze the qualitative nature of this crisis, distinguishing the philosophical Nigredo from the pathology of clinical depression. While they share a somatic and emotional symptomatology, lethargy, anhedonia, withdrawal, their teleology, their end purpose, is fundamentally radically different. This distinction is the razor's edge upon which the sanity of the adept balances. Clinical pathology is often circular. It is a feedback loop of chemical malfunction or trauma response that leads to stagnation. It is a labyrinth with no exit. The Nigredo, conversely, is linear and narrative. It is a tunnel. The suffering of the Nigredo is friction. Friction occurs when a moving object meets resistance. In this case, the movement is the evolutionary drive of the soul, and the resistance is the calcified structure of the ego. The pain, therefore, is proof of movement. It is growing pain on a metaphysical scale. The crisis of the Nigredo represents the encounter with the absurd. As the meaning structures of the persona collapse, religion, status, ideology, the adept looks out at the universe and sees a void. The comforting narratives are gone. This is the abyss of the Kabbalah, Da'ath. For the secular mind, the void is a source of nihilistic terror. For the Hermeticist, the void is the womb of potential. St. John of the Cross described this as the dark night of the senses, followed by the dark night of the spirit. The dryness experienced here is a necessary weaning process. If the spiritual path were always paved with bliss, ecstasy, and synchronous miracles, the adept would become addicted to the sensation of spirituality, rather than the truth of it. We would be spiritual gluttons eating the sweets of the divine. The Nigredo cuts off the supply of spiritual sugar. Prayer feels empty. Meditation feels like staring at a wall. The magic seems to have died. This is the test. The universe is asking, do you love the giver or only the gift? This phase forces the confrontation with existential loneliness. The adept realizes that ultimately they are alone in the vessel. No guru, no book, and no lover can do the work for them. This is the solitary path. It is the forging of self-reliance. The danger here is the retrograde movement, the desire to go back to the Egypt of unconsciousness, because the desert of the initiation is too harsh. The psyche screams for relief. It tempts the adept with the false gold of numbness, alcohol, mindless entertainment, or fanatical adherence to dogma. But the philosophical necessity of this suffering cannot be overstated. Pain is the only force capable of breaking the shell of the ego. As the Sufi mystic Rumi said, the wound is the place where the light enters you. The Nigredo is the process of being wounded by the truth. It is the shattering of the idol of the self, so that the living God, the integrated reality, can emerge. The despair felt is the ego realizing its own finitude in the face of the infinite. It is a holy defeat. As the adept persists in the work, holding the tension, enduring the fire, and refusing to flee the darkness, a subtle shift occurs. The color of the operation begins to change. The deep black of the Nigredo gives way to the gray of dawn, and eventually to the albedo, the whitening. This transition is not marked by a fanfare of trumpets, but by the emergence of a profound, unshakable stability. The outcome of the Nigredo is the birth of the philosophical self. This is not the restoration of the old ego, but the construction of a new center of gravity. In the symbolism of the Rosarium Philosophorum, this is the resurrection of the king and queen, now fused into a single being, the rebis. Psychologically, this corresponds to individuation. The adept who has survived the Nigredo possesses a shadow-integrated personality. They are no longer naive. They know the depths of their own capacity for evil, and thus their choice to do good is exactly that, a choice, not a compulsion of social conditioning. The result is a state of gnosis, knowledge, rather than pistis, faith. The adept does not believe in the reality of the psyche. They know it because they have survived its storms. This leads to the cauda pavonis, the peacock's tail, the appearance of all colors. Once the blackness is integrated, the world is re-enchanted. The adept sees the world not as a resource to be exploited, but as a symbolic theater. The energy that was dammed up flows back into the world, but it is now purified. It flows through the lens of wisdom, not projection. Ethical implications. The application of this state for the modern individual is profound. The integrated adept becomes a pillar of stability in a chaotic world. Because they have faced their own internal apocalypse, they are less likely to be triggered by the external apocalypses of politics or society. They possess ataraxia, an untroubled mind. This brings a heavy moral responsibility. The Hermetic axiom is to know, to dare, to will, to keep silent. The adept now has the power of clear vision. They act with noblesse oblige, the nobility of the spirit. They treat others with compassion, not because it is nice, but because they recognize the secret suffering of the Nigredo in everyone they meet. They become the therapeuti of the world, healing simply by their presence, by being a vessel that has withstood the fire. The necessity of the school. This is why the discipline of the Hermetic School is not a hobby, it is a survival mechanism. Without the container of the tradition, the Nigredo looks like madness. Without the rigorous study of the texts, the symbols appear as nonsense. The school provides the athanor, the furnace that contains the heat. We study the maps left by the ancients, Paracelsus, Maya, Jung, Flamel, so that when the darkness falls, we do not panic. We recognize the landmarks. We know that the raven is the messenger of the work's beginning, and the skull is the promise of resurrection. The work is hard. It is the opus contra naturam, the work against nature, against the path of least resistance. But it is the only work worth doing, for in the end, the Nigredo proves that the soul is not a thing to be fixed, but a fire to be tended. The lead that weighs upon your heart is not a burden, it is an anchor holding you steady, while the storm strips away the illusion of who you thought you were. Do not pray for the darkness to lift before its time. The gold you seek is not found by fleeing the crucible, but by the will that dares to burn along with it. The stone is not found, it is forged in the ash.